I found out my best friend was sleeping with my girlfriend on a Tuesday. I remember that specifically, because I'd just gotten off a 12-hour shift, and stopped at the grocery store on the way home to pick up the ingredients for her favorite pasta. I was standing in the checkout line holding a box of rigatoni and a jar of marinara, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. No message, just a photo. I stood there in that fluorescent light, people shuffling past me with their carts. And I looked at that photo for probably 30 seconds before my brain caught up with what my eyes were seeing. My girlfriend, my apartment, my best friend's car keys on the nightstand. I recognized the keychain. A little brass anchor I'd given him as a joke when he moved to Portland 2 years ago, and then moved back 6 months later because Portland didn't work out. I put the rigatoni back on the shelf. I left the store. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for about 20 minutes, just staring at the concrete divider in front of me. Then I drove home. His name was Kurt. We'd been friends since 9th grade. 22 years. He was in my corner when my dad got sick, when I lost my first real job, when I crashed my motorcycle, and spent 3 weeks on my sister's couch, because I couldn't walk right. He was my emergency contact for 4 years running. I'd co-signed on his car loan when his credit was destroyed from the divorce. I let him stay in my spare room for 8 months, no rent, no questions. Just get back on your feet, man. Take your time. Her name was Fiona. We'd been together for 3 years. I'd started looking at rings. When I got to my apartment that night, her car was gone. His car was gone. There was a note on the kitchen counter. We need to talk. Call me when you're ready. I read it twice, set it down, and started making a mental inventory of everything in that apartment that was mine. I didn't call her. I didn't text Kurt. I'm not going to pretend I handled it with perfect composure that first night. I didn't. I sat on my kitchen floor and I stayed there for a while. But here's what I didn't do. I didn't call anyone. I didn't blow up their phones. I didn't drive to Kurt's place to confront him. Something in me knew, with total clarity, that whatever happened next, I did not want to do it in a state where I couldn't think straight. So I went to bed. I didn't sleep, but I went to bed. By morning I'd made 4 decisions. First, I was going to call my bank before anything else. Second, I was going to call a lawyer. Third, I was going to find a new apartment. Fourth, I was done, with both of them, with no exceptions and no conversation. Fiona and I weren't married. So the legal piece was simpler than it could have been. But we'd been splitting rent on that apartment for 2 years and my name was on the lease. That was my leverage. I called the property management office that morning, and gave them 30 days notice. Under my name, my prerogative. Then I called my bank and moved the money we'd kept in a shared account. It had been set up for household expenses, and the bulk of what was in it was my contributions. Into a separate account she had no access to. I documented everything. I didn't do any of this out of cruelty. I did it because I understood something in those early hours that I hadn't fully understood before. The moment you find out, the clock starts, and the people who hurt you are already thinking about their next move. You have to think about yours. The lawyer I called was someone my dad's friend had used in a property dispute years back. I explained the situation. No marriage, shared lease, commingled funds in a household account. She walked me through my options in about 45 minutes, and charged me $200 for the consultation, which was the best money I'd spent in years. Everything was clean. No shared property, no joint debt beyond the car. Kurt still owed me on, which I'd co-signed, not paid, but my name was attached to. That was the only complication. I spent that week making phone calls and signing paperwork. Fiona called twice. I sent her to voicemail both times. Kurt texted 6 times over 3 days. I read the first one, bro. I know how this looks. Please just hear me out. And then I blocked his number. I know how this looks. 22 years and that's what he led with. On day 8, I found a place. A 1-bedroom in a neighborhood I liked, 3rd floor. Good light. Month to month, for the first 3 months while I figured things out. I hired 2 guys off an app to help me move on a Saturday. The whole thing took 4 hours. I left anything that was ambiguously ours behind. I didn't want any of it. I wanted a clean room with my stuff in it and no reminders. Fiona came back to the apartment while I was moving out. She stood in the doorway and watched me carry boxes for a minute, and then she said, "Can we please just talk about this?" I handed a box to one of the movers. I said, "There's nothing to talk about." She said, "You're not even going to ask me why?" I thought about that for a second. I thought about the rigatoni. I thought about the rings I'd been researching. I said, "No." She started crying. I kept moving boxes. I'm not telling that story to make myself sound hard. I was gutted. I was absolutely hollowed out, in a way I hadn't felt since my dad's funeral. But I'd made my decision, and I knew that the second I sat down and let her talk, I would be in a different kind of conversation. One where the goal was to manage me, not to be honest with me. I'd watched enough people get pulled back into situations exactly like this to know that "can we talk" almost never means "I want to take responsibility." It almost always means "I want to explain until you feel like you're overreacting." I wasn't overreacting. I moved out. I got the lease terminated. I updated my address with my bank, my employer, my gym, my doctor. I got a new email address. I deleted my Facebook account. I'd barely used it anyway, but Fiona and Kurt were both on there. And so were at least a dozen people in our shared circle, who I had no interest in navigating. I kept Instagram but went private, and removed everyone from that group. I didn't make any announcement. I didn't post anything. I just quietly stopped being accessible. Here's the part that surprised me. About 2 weeks after I moved, I started getting calls from people I'd considered friends. Not Kurt's friends specifically, our friends. The group we'd all built together over the last several years. A guy named Paul, who I'd gone camping with a dozen times. A woman named Roxanne, who Fiona and I had done a New Year's Eve thing with 2 years in a row. My coworker Demetrius, who was loosely connected to the whole group through Paul. The calls all had the same general shape. Some version of, "Hey, I heard what happened, I just want to say I'm sorry, but also, have you thought about talking to them?" Like, really talking? Because they're pretty torn up about it, and I think there might be more to the story. There's more to the story. I want to sit with that phrase for a second, because I heard some version of it from 4 different people. More to the story. As if the photo hadn't been specific enough. As if 22 years of friendship and 3 years of a relationship could produce a contexted text in which that photo meant something other than what it obviously meant. Paul called me twice. The second time I picked up because I'd known Paul longer than I'd known Fiona, and I thought he might actually be calling as a friend rather than as an ambassador. He was a decent guy. I didn't think he'd do that. He did that. They didn't mean for it to happen, he said. You know how it is. These things. I said, Paul, I'm going to stop you there. He stopped. I said, I know you mean well. But I'm not interested in context and I'm interested in a conversation about what they meant or didn't mean. I made my decision. I'd appreciate it if you didn't reach out about this again. He said, man, I just don't want to see this friendship end over. I said, it already ended. Take care of yourself, Paul. I hung up. I texted him once more to say I wished him well and that I wasn't going to be responding to anything further on this topic. Then I moved on. The hardest call was from my cousin Bridget. She's 5 years older than me, and was probably the closest thing I had to an older sibling growing up. She called me about 3 weeks in, and unlike Paul, she wasn't trying to sell me on forgiveness. She was just worried. You've gone dark, she said. I haven't heard from you in almost a month. I'm okay, I said. I'm just dealing with things quietly. Kurt called me, she said. I didn't say anything. He's not asking me to do anything, she said quickly. I think he's scared. He knows how serious this is. Good, I said. He should. There was a pause. Bridget knows me well enough to know when I've made up my mind about something. She didn't push. She asked if I was eating, if I was sleeping, if I needed anything. I told her the truth. I was eating fine. I was sleeping badly. And what I needed was for people to stop acting like there was a version of this with a different ending. She said, okay, I love you. Call me when you're ready to just talk about something else. I called her 3 days later and we talked about her kids for an hour. That was the right call, and she was the right person to make it. The part nobody tells you about going no contact is that the silence from the other side eventually gets loud in a different way. At first it's a relief. No more calls, no more voicemails, no more "they're really sorry" from third parties who weren't there and don't know. But then a few months pass, and the silence starts to accumulate. And you start to understand what it means. It means they've accepted it. It means they're living their lives. And something in you, even when you made the right call, even when you know you made the right call, has to sit with the fact that it's really over. I sat with it at a therapist I'd been seeing on and off for about 2 years, mostly around stuff with my dad's illnesses. I went consistently for about 5 months after all of this happened. Best thing I did. She didn't tell me I was wrong. She didn't tell me I was right. She just helped me understand what I was actually grieving. Which wasn't Fiona, exactly, and wasn't Kurt, exactly. It was the version of my life I'd believed I was building. The one with the ring and the shared apartment and the friend who'd stand next to me at my wedding one day. That version was gone, and I had to grieve it before I could figure out what the actual version of my life looked like. About 4 months in, I got an email. New account, my work address, which is semi-public. The subject line was just my name. It was from Kurt. I don't know how long he spent writing it. It was long. I read the first paragraph, which was an apology, and then I scrolled to the bottom to see how it ended. It ended with a phone number, and the words, "I just need you to know I'm sorry. You don't have to respond." I didn't respond. I forwarded it to my lawyer with a note asking if there was anything I needed to be aware of from a legal standpoint, given that he still had a debt connected to my co-signature on his car. She said no, the loan was in good standing, nothing to worry about. I thanked her and I closed the email thread. I want to be honest about something. Reading that email was harder than I expected. Not because it changed anything. It didn't, but because for a split second I could hear Kurt's actual voice in those sentences. And I had to remember that the person who wrote that email was the same person who had been in my apartment with my girlfriend, with a brass anchor keychain on the nightstand. Those two things existed simultaneously. The person who was sorry, and the person who did it. I had to hold both of those at once, and then, I had to let the email sit in my sent folder, and go back to my day. That was the last time Kurt contacted me. Fiona, as far as I know, moved in with him about 2 months after everything fell apart. I heard this from Roxanne, who I'd kept at arm's length but hadn't entirely cut off. Roxanne had always been more Fiona's friend than mine, and I figured she was going to be in that camp, eventually, but she was honest enough to just tell me plainly without trying to make it a conversation about forgiveness. She texts, "You should know. FYI only." I appreciated that. I texted back, "Thanks for telling me." And that was that. I won't pretend that piece of news didn't land a certain way. It did, but it also clarified something. I'd spent some part of the last few months wondering if maybe this had been an isolated thing. A terrible lapse. Something that didn't mean what I thought it meant. 2 months was fast. 2 months is not a lapse. 2 months means something had already been building, and I just hadn't known about it. In some ways that made the whole thing easier. I threw myself into work in a way I hadn't since I was in my mid-20s and hungry for everything. I'm in civil engineering, project management side, and I'd been comfortable for a few years in a role that was good but not stretching me. I started looking and found a position with a firm in a city 3 hours north that was offering a significant step up, both in scope and in salary. I interviewed twice, did a presentation for the senior partners, and got the offer 2 weeks later. I took it. I gave my notice, packed what was left of my life into a moving truck, and drove north on a Thursday morning. I want to be specific about what it felt to cross the city limits that day, because I've tried to describe it to people and usually fall short. It wasn't joy, exactly. It wasn't relief, exactly. It was more like gravity had been pulling me in a particular direction for a long time without me fully feeling it. And now I was pointed somewhere else, and the air felt different. I had a coffee in the cup holder and a podcast on and 300 miles ahead of me. And I felt, for the first time in about a year, like I was moving towards something instead of away from something. That distinction matters. I've been up here for 14 months now. I've got a good apartment, good colleagues, a project I'm actually proud of. A bridge rehabilitation contract that's been one of the most technically interesting things I've worked on in my career. I took up running, which I'd always meant to do and never had. I've met some people, I've gone on some dates. Nothing serious yet, but I'm not in a hurry. I know now what I didn't know when I was standing in that checkout line with a box of rigatoni. I know exactly what I will and won't accept. And I know I'd rather wait a long time than settle for something that was never actually solid. A few weeks ago I was at a work happy hour, and one of my coworkers, a structural engineer named Ted, who's been at the firm about as long as I have, asked me something nobody had asked me in a while. He was asking about my background, where I was from, and when I mentioned the city where I'd spent most of my 30s, he said, "What made you leave?" I thought about how to answer that. "I needed a change," I said. He nodded. "Those are usually good if you make the call yourself." "Yeah," I said. "I made the call. There's nothing dramatic about where I am right now. I don't have a triumphant ending, where Kurt's car got repossessed, or Fiona called me crying, or the group chat imploded in some satisfying way. As far as I know, they're all fine. I hope they are, actually, not because I've forgiven anyone, but because I genuinely do not have the energy or interest to hope otherwise. The people who hurt me are living their lives. I am living mine. Those two facts don't have to be in conflict. What I do have is this. I wake up in an apartment that is exactly the way I want it. I go to work on things that matter to me. I have a handful of friendships that are real and uncomplicated. I have a therapist I see once a month now, down from once a week. And she tells me I seem settled. I am settled. I am the most settled I have been since my 20s, and I got there by making a decision I never second-guessed and honoring it completely. People sometimes ask, not often, but sometimes, if I regret how I handled it, if I should have talked to them, I should have talked to them. Gotten closure. Heard them out. I think about that question seriously every time I'm asked it, because I think it deserves a serious answer. The closure I needed didn't come from a conversation. It came from moving out. It came from the new lease and the new email address and the truck headed north on a Thursday. It came from 5 months of therapy and 14 months of building something that belongs entirely to me. That's what closure actually looks like. It's not a conversation where someone explains themselves. It's the moment you stop needing one. I haven't needed one in a long time.